everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Achieve Engagement for hosting this event. I'm Elise Smith. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Praxis Labs. At the highest level, Praxis Labs is an immersive learning and development company. We're focused on helping build inclusive leadership skills across large and small enterprises. And like Zach, I am so excited for this conversation. I'm glad you've joined us. And I am going to make an assumption. If you're on the line or listening to the recording, you're here because you care about driving DEI outcomes. And you are a believer that L&D has a role to play in helping achieve those outcomes. And what's beautiful is you are not the only one. I agree with you. So do your brilliant panelists, Lisa and Jarvis. But I also think what makes this webinar and this community, everyone who's watching live and later, so special is we are in this together. We're coming out of a year where we've seen pushback, we've seen questioning, and we're still here. We're still doing the work. And like Zach said, we have the opportunity to learn from each other, to support each other in helping to create more inclusive workplaces and communities, helping to develop our teams, to celebrate different perspectives, to see each other, and to solve the most pressing business challenges in front of them. So I echo Zach, please keep adding your name, your role, your company, your LinkedIn in the chat, say hi, what brought you here, what you're working on, so we can all continue to grow our network. We can all support each other, all of the folks who are doing this work day in and day out. So with that said, let's dive in. We have two wonderful humans with us today. I have questions for these folks, but we'll open it up to Q&A, so add those in the chat as well. I think the best place to start is always to just learn more about the panelists that we have. And so I would love if Lisa and Jarvis, you could both share a little bit more about yourself, your career journey, what brought you to this work at the intersection of DEI and L&D. And maybe I'll start with you, Lisa.
Thank you, Elise. Good, I got it set up. Usually I'm talking and I'm on mute. We got that figured out early. That's one of my greatest talents, by the way. Anyways, thank you for having us here. So pleased to be a part of this conversation. I work for Westat. I've been with Westat for almost 3 years now. We are headquartered in Rockville, Maryland. I am one of the remote employees. I'm actually located in Long Island. I saw someone mention that they're from Ottawa. I'm from Toronto, so we're neighbors. Welcome. Like I mentioned, I've been with the company just for a little while. I will say that last year we actually celebrated our 60th anniversary. That was exciting. It was a great year for us overall. In general, as a research company, our mission at a very high level is really just to improve lives through research, and that's what we really are committed to doing. We are largely a government contractor and everything that implies. But also I think worth noting is that we are an employee-owned company. I had never worked for one before, so pleased to be working for one now. I just think that it helps us to prioritize our employees because our employees are our stakeholders, so it's a very unique environment in that sense. I will also note that we are very new to our DEI journey. I would say we started formalizing DEI within Westat probably around 2020. And whereas 2020 may be a reasonable amount of time for companies that started maybe 2 years earlier, like I said, we've been around for 60 years and have started to kind of formalize this. So we're new on our journey. So we're learning a lot of lessons. And I think that really starting this journey was driven by a few different events or factors rather. I would say the George Floyd event, for like a lot of people, really had people stop and sit back and think about, okay, how are we going to approach our work? Also, we have very vocal employees. I think that's related to the fact that, like I said, we're an employee-owned company. I love the amount of engagement that comes with being a part of an employee-owned company, and a change in leadership. So we had some changes and just leaders who were particularly committed to DEI and how that should be defined within our company. And I'll stop there.
Well,
I don't want to take up all the time.
You are dropping so many gems we're going to pick up and dissect later. But I'm curious, you personally, what brought you on this journey? How did you get to DEI and L&D?
I began really in L&D, but I will say early on, I had interests in just in DEI. And I mean, the group as a Black woman, how could you not? You see things from a certain perspective. You wonder, do other people see it? And if they don't, how do I make them see it? I did my doctorate at Rutgers University. My dissertation topic was on interviewing and negotiation skills among Black professionals. I knew that in general, you know, Black professionals make less money than white professionals, and really just trying to dissect that, get a sense of why that is. Um, to what role do we maybe play because we don't have certain connections, or we don't have certain knowledge, or we're not maybe as connected in terms of learning how to negotiate and so forth. So what role does maybe the organization play? What role, can we change, or what dynamics can we change in order to kind of get ourselves up on a level playing field? And that's really what drove that. And so I've always kind of had a foot both in L&D and in DEI. And this is really the first time that I've had the opportunity to bring them together. And it's just been something that's been happening, I think, for a long time.
Oh, Lisa, thank you so much for sharing. And it sounds like it's both personal, it's intellectual, and it's the work you do now. So excited to dive in. Jarvis, will you share a little bit more about yourself, your career journey, what brought you to the intersection of DEI and L&D?
Absolutely, Elise. It's such a great pleasure to be joining you. So thank you so much to you and the practice team, as well as the team at Achieve Engagement. So I currently run a DEI consulting agency called the Rainbow Disruption, where we partner with a number of Fortune 500 companies, academic institutions, and nonprofit organizations to help them recognize the capability and potential of what happens when diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging are truly integrated and embedded in systems and processes within organizations. I've been in the space for a little over a decade now. So prior to launching my own firm, I served as the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Nike, where I was for about 5 years in a variety of different roles. Before that, I served as Snapchat's very first head of DE&I out in LA. And then prior to that was at Google as part of their diversity and recruitment teams. But ultimately started my career with Deloitte as a strategy and operations consultant. I'm originally from the great city of Houston, Texas. I see a couple of shout outs in the chat there. And currently, though, reside both in Portland, Oregon, and LA. For me, my passion for this work is really threefold. First, I did a lot of coursework. I did my undergrad degree at Rice and then my grad degree at Brown. And as part of my coursework there, I was looking at academic approaches to how we apply elements of DEI to certain industries. I saw a gap, though, in the way academic institutions were talking about the work, how society engages with it, and then what this means for corporate DEI. And so I wanted to fuse the two or three together, which is why I also proudly serve as a professor of practice at UC Berkeley and Brown to help students, business school students, recognize how this applies in their day-to-day work and how they build approaches as people leaders and executives to help bring this to life. The second piece for me was definitely out of personal passion. As a very proud Black gay man, I have navigated spaces where my intersectional identities made me feel not enough for various different communities of which I was navigating. And I found myself covering so many different elements of my experience along the journey and along the way. And third and finally, and I talk about this a lot, and we'll get into some of this in a moment. I released my first book in October, DEI Credential. And in it, I describe these experiences of trying to show up as my fullest and authentic self in the workplace, and yet feeling that it was those exact same elements that were the biggest reasons why either promotion or progression was being limited or otherwise. And so as we get into this conversation of the role that DEI and L&D play together in fostering a more improved employee experience, I think we'll be able to highlight a couple of different areas for how to make that happen.
Oh my goodness, Jarvis, thank you so much for sharing your background. Clearly, we have just so much experience, so much perspective, and I think similarities, right? So much of our stories, mine included, is both personal and intellectual. So similarly, I'm brought to this work through my parents, my lived experiences, and my parents fighting for educational equity in Chicago, where I grew up. The intellectual work I did in higher education institutions and in work at IBM Watson, using early commercialization of AI to think about how do we personalize, how do we measure learning, and then ultimately investing in innovative ways to train on DEI, leadership, soft skills, and really seeing an opportunity to do more outcomes-based measurement, to do more research-backed design so that you can actually have that real impact. And so okay, let's just dive in. I want to start with what might feel like an obvious question, but I'm curious to get your perspective on what are the skills, behaviors, attitudes, or mindsets that DEI and L&D should be coming and can be coming together to help develop within workforces. What are they? Why are they important to prioritize developing? There's so much on everyone's plate right now. Why should we be focusing on this? And maybe we start with you, Jarvis.
When we think about where L&D and DEI play together, oftentimes people don't think about the fact that it really is a large Venn diagram that has a very big center. There is so many overlapping capabilities that can be built and driven when the two functions partner together. When you think about the essence of what DEI seeks to do within organizations, it really is focusing on helping individual contributors, people managers, as well as executive leaders build the competency that enables us to create effective employee experiences that ultimately translates to innovation and creativity and how we do our products. That's it. It's really that simple. But to do that, we have to have some form of enablement to allow that to happen. This is where L&D functions come into play. I've often said that learning or education in general is the prerequisite to the fostering of equity. It's through learning moments where we teach people what skills and competencies allows us to improve in the workplace, but it's also within those functions where we help people unlearn certain prejudices, stereotypes, and perspectives that they might hold that impact who and how they navigate the workplace. And so when L&D organizations come together to foster that enablement, we create an environment where, whether it's through required learning or training, or even some of the optional course tracks that we position for folks, learning is utilized as a conduit to help organizations make great progress and actually shift elements of culture and climate. On the development side, manager enablement is everything. I cannot stress enough the impact that commitment and investment from senior leadership, the perspectives from employee resource groups or bottoms up approaches of individual contributors can only go so far. People leave organizations and retention is largely impacted by ineffective leadership by people managers. And so, how we build their capability is absolutely necessary. But here's what often happens: we will have DEI functions build or develop certain trainings, take unconscious bias awareness, conversations on microaggressions or cultural competency, and those sit in one area. Then we have L&D teams doing some more foundational work on topics like manager effectiveness, on performance management. Those two are rarely intersecting with each other, and so we're missing a critical opportunity to help these leaders move from theory to application, where they understand throughout performance management processes, throughout hiring processes, here's how all those elements of bias and cultural competence that I taught you might fit in as we think about driving continuous development and improvement within our organization. And so the broad shift that needs to happen, at least, is us, instead of seeing these as two siloed circles, truly starting to understand what that Venn diagram is and how can we make that center so much stronger across both of our teams.
Yeah, I love that. And I think part of what you're speaking to is learning or enablement being that prerequisite for equity and inclusion, to me comes back to the fact that oftentimes the workplace is the first place we've had to work or interact across difference. Our lives are so segregated, regardless of if you're in the US or abroad. And we do need to learn. We do need to unlearn. And so learning inherently has to play a role, right? And I loved how you talked about moving from theory to application. It's not enough to say, okay, here's how you give feedback. Go give feedback. It's how do I do it? And how can I get at bats? How do I get reps to practice doing it with a lens of inclusion, a lens to creating outcomes that add value for us all instead of causing harm, right? Lisa, I'm curious, when you think about what are these attitudes, mindsets, behaviors that DEI and L&D need to come together to develop, do you have a different perspective, or what would you say to add to what Jarvis shared?
Yeah, I think I'll definitely be echoing a lot of what Jarvis said. So why does it make sense to combine, well, for us, in the way that we're structured, why does it make sense to combine DEI and L&D? I mean, it's simple. Or as Jarvis said, it's both simple and complicated, depending on what element of it you're talking about. But it's simple in terms of they both directly contribute to growing our talent. So it just makes sense for them to be connected, but they do so, I think, in different ways. So DEI, what we're hoping to gain, or what we aim for, in addition to other things, is to shape a culture where our employees can bring their authentic selves to work and therefore identify and display their genuine talents. And that may sound cliche, but it makes sense. That's really what we're going for. And what L&D does is it comes along and then it enhances those talents that these employees have identified and that they're developing. And it grows the skills related to them through meaningful experience, exposure, and education. Some of you who've done training, you'll recognize those as the 3 E's. And then the hope, of course, is by combining that, then, we help our employees to perform at their highest potential. Really, we've discovered that you can't have one without the other. So our L&D efforts really need to be done through a DEI lens to ensure inclusiveness and to make sure that it resonates with our diverse population. And we also need our supervisors in particular to understand and demonstrate our commitment to DEI and ensure that all employees have the opportunity to thrive. On the other hand, our DEI efforts need to be done through an L&D lens, then to make sure that we provide resources around the 3 E's that I mentioned, and that, our outcomes are tangible and measurable. So it just makes sense, and it works very well with our team to have the two working together. There is no training that we're going to do, especially with supervisors, without it going through our DEI specialists to make sure that we're using the right language, that we're touching on real DEI issues, that we're not just developing speaking of skills, a lot of the so-called trainings that we do around DEI is really raising awareness. So some of the obvious stuff like unconscious bias and so forth, but just other basic things like, when do you get HR involved with certain things? What are our policies and how does that support our commitment to diversity and so forth? But even specifically in terms of team development, even if we have an L&D initiative that speaks to developing skills around team development and so forth. Well, how do we make sure that our supervisors are doing this consistently so that everyone has the opportunity to grow, but also uniquely, because each of their team members have different needs. So yeah, it's very simple, the fact that they need to support each other, but the way in which we do that, can be difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really I'm hearing from both of you this focus on people leaders, our managers, on supervisors as being a core part of our workforce that we really need to focus on. And I'm seeing that and hearing that from all of our clients as well. The number of times I've heard we're reimagining or we're reorganizing our people leader development program, or we need to do something different here. And I think it's because, to your point that you both have made, supervisors, people leaders, managers are so core to moving our organizations forward with a lens of equity and inclusion. They are key to everyone who comes into the organization. They are what moves the company forward. And without helping them build that awareness, but also build that muscle and that practice to apply the learning, we're not going to make the difference that we want, because they really are touching more of our workforce and oftentimes more of our clients and customers than other parts of the organization. Lisa, you use this phrase that L&D efforts need to be done through a DEI lens, and DEI efforts need to be done through an L&D lens. And I think that's so powerful, because I think it speaks to the really in sync coordination that's needed. And I'm curious, we've seen L&D and DEI partner and it goes really well, but we also know sometimes there's some challenges. I've heard from some folks that we get to work with that it's not always smooth sailing. And so I'm curious to hear from both of you if you've had or experienced or supported companies that have had trouble coordinating L&D and DE&I in a way that allows them to do their best work. What challenges are they facing in integrating these initiatives? And what have you seen work to navigate through that? Lisa, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, okay. So I think for us, so when we think about L&D and DEI, they both have elements, in my experience, of consulting, but also providing deliverables. But I think the balance looks different for both elements. So for L&D, we tend to see more of a focus on deliverables. For DEI, I tend to see more of of component of consulting. So therefore, they kind of have different models and they require different approaches, but somehow they still need to be integrated. So kind of figuring that out. What is our model for each? What is our approach for each? How do we approach them? How do we communicate the way that these two elements work together for our employees to understand? Is requires some work. And I think we just need to really find the right balance of also a bottom up and a top down approach. As I mentioned, we're an employee owned company. And so a lot of our work has started from the employees and their input. And really now I think we're trying to, as we create some more structure around what that looks like, kind of figure out what the balance should be between what's kind of coming from the top and is developed at the top versus what's coming from employees and their feedback. So.
Yeah, yeah, I love that this acknowledgement that the work of DE&I and L&D functions might be different in how they operate, but still the need to coordinate, and to have the ask coming from employees. It's like, well, we want this. Now, how do we deliver on it? Jarvis, I'm curious if what you've seen in terms of the challenges that that L&D and DEI teams might face in trying to collaborate, and how you've seen them work through it. What's your take here?
I think there's three key areas, and I'll just add a caveat that what I'm about to highlight is rooted in critique, which I think is very productive for all of us, not criticism. The first piece is personal agenda connected to it. At the end of the day, if you take a look at talent acquisition teams in organizations and learning and development teams within organizations, they look very different. And I'm talking phenotypically, the look of the people, the identity of the people, they look different than DEI teams. Let that soak in for a second. The representation of where people of color, primarily and underrepresented folks, are within organizations tends to see an over-indexing of people of color represented in DEI organizations and a significant underrepresentation of people of color in and leading L&D and talent acquisition organizations. This matters because oftentimes when then communities of color are advocating for more of a sharp focus on DEI education, it starts to feel like a personal agenda, where the reality is we are also trying to move together the collective essence of the work. But when we can position this dichotomy that one group is advocating for their own identity or what they care about, it does start to seem diametrically opposed to the other. And so my first highlight and recommendation there is organizations need to obsess the diversification of their L&D and talent acquisition teams as much as they do their DEI teams, because that's how we can start to foster greater improvement in our work. I say this because every organization that I've worked with before, again, critique, not criticism, has had that duality where my core partner, being the head of DEI in my role at these organizations, my core partner and their teams have been relatively monolithic without strong representation of people of color. Number two, territorial without accountability. Oftentimes in these spaces, we're COE functions oftentimes within our organizations, particularly if both groups are within HR functions. And so as a COE, we're only as good as the likelihood that our HR business partners, that our employee relations partners, that our legal partners are willing to do just that, partner with us. And so there's this territorial identity that can sometimes happen that says, I own this work, I own this space, I own this strategy, you own this work, this space, or this strategy. And what it does is it creates a reduced system of accountability on either side and for those people that we're partnering with. Here's what happens. A topic or issue comes up where great development practice could be utilized for a people leader on topics like demonstration of microaggressive behavior. That is immediately lobbed over the fence to DEI teams, and there's little to no engagement with L&D teams. Here's what happens though. We're not often experts in adult learning. And so we miss out on a real opportunity to promote that stickiness that could exist that would foster how do we actually make this accountable for this people leader. Then the HR business partner can play a critical role at coming in to ensure constant reinforcement. With the way in which we're operating today, we sit in our territories. We sit in our dominance of here is my job, and we rarely engage in a crossover of shared or collective accountability. And the reality is when it typically falls on DEI teams. And so we have to be very knowledgeable and quite frankly, logical and look at the experiences of where this is happening. The third and final area where I think we get into some challenges is Oftentimes, when DEI leaders and teams are placed specifically in HR functions, it can work. So hear me loud and clear. It can work. I know that some of my peers in the DEI space are very much opposed to it. It can work. But one of the biggest challenges that happens is when we assume that an L&D leader, a VP of L&D, a VP of OE or OD are operating at the same quote peer level as the DEI leader, it's a bit of a challenge because this DEI leader in an optimal world is actually doing work impacting product, brand and consumer, people and culture, innovation, all of these different areas, which is not necessarily the case of some of these peer groups or peer sets. And so there's a lack of understanding of what does my job description entail and what role do you play functionally in helping us to advance that. And so I think if we can overcome that topic of role clarity, the territorial versus the accountable, and intentionally diversify the representation of those other orgs that don't often see that, it will go a long way toward creating resolution.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think you've distilled a lot of the points that we've kind of seen in the workplaces we've been at, right? Versus first that the diversity of the organizations of DE&I and L&D typically, but also that role clarity, the territorial versus accountable. I love that. And I think if we can have shared and collective accountability, that's where the work really takes form. So I think that's quite powerful. Those are some of the challenges, but I know there are examples of where it goes well and where it's successful and where the impact has been seen. What have you seen to be impactful? And I'll say, I can share a little bit about what we're seeing with our clients after, but I want to start with you first, Jarvis, and some of the work you're doing with clients and what you've seen in previous orgs you've been at. What is the successful kind of model you hold up of L&D and DEI partnership? What are the outcomes that were driven?
Operationally, one of the things that we did at Nike is I had a teammate embedded in my organization that was actually accountable for running L&D focused topics related to DEI. And so she operated back and forth between my team and a dotted line reporting relationship into the L&D function. What this enabled us to do is to keep dialogue going and strong. And here's what I say in the space. Where teams see mishaps, and I see this with some of my clients that I'm working with, I've seen this with institutions I've worked with, particularly in the technology industry, is we communicate with each other almost to a fault. We over communicate. We don't understand, though, the difference between communication and comprehension. In this regard, comprehension is an understanding of your needs, you understanding mine, and then us coming together for a shared or collective approach to how we move the work forward. What works really well is identifying, and RACI models are really helpful in this space. In what areas am I truly the one that holds the big A on accountability here? And what spaces are you responsible? And how do we make sure that we over-indexed on consultation and inform on an ongoing basis? It's not for me to get in your business or you to get in mine, but at the end of the day, we don't work we work for institutions. We work for organizations, we work for enterprises. And so the true enterprise thinker is one that can say, we are building as a team to ultimately deliver as a team. It's a decentering of oneself in our role. And so when we get to a space where that happens, it goes a long way. But even more practically, folks, do a team offsite. Bring together the L&D folks, bring together the DEI folks, and let's put our strategy houses right next to each other. And let's figure out what are the areas that we can create supercharged capabilities in each other's space that can go a long way. I'm working with a couple of clients right now, and we've had what I didn't necessarily think of as aha moments, but I'm very glad that it was received that way for them. It was like, why don't we just embed some of these topics on manager capability and bias into onboarding? Capture people early, help them recognize this is a part of our culture, this is a part of our way of working. And they've seen such tremendous results. This is work that we already have, but we've created this cadence that we're used to or familiar with, and we believe that that's the only way of doing it. Think about how do we do this early and often? Oftentimes in this space, when I'm working with clients, at least I introduced them to a model that I built that focuses on two S's and two M's. I call it my Rihanna framework of S&M. And so what it includes is sustainability and scalability. So how do we create approaches that truly are sustainable across DEI and L&D? That's where that stickiness happens. And then how can we make sure that it is long lasting, but can also scale whether we're in retail populations, distribution center populations, and our corporate teammates. And how do we scale globally, particularly for communities where English may not be their first language? On the M's, it's an effective approach to measurement and monitoring. This is not about your win. This is about our win. And so when we rolled out our enterprise-wide unconscious bias awareness training, it was one of the very last projects actually that I worked on at Nike before departing. Um, Oh, we were in it with L&D every single day. And in fact, they took the lead on it. We were content subject matter experts, but they led the operational capabilities. And so when we rolled it out and very quickly got to a north of 80% completion rate across all geographies in a matter of weeks, oh, you better believe that was our collective win when it was featured on corporate all hands. We didn't miss an opportunity to recognize and reward each other's teams. Simple things like that, everybody, can go a long way toward creating very powerful and comfortable relationships across teams and defining strategies that actually work and that can be measured.
Yeah, I love that. And it really sounds like the core of a successful partnership is letting the teams be expert in what they're expert in. Learning and development, talent development, they are learning science experts. They know how to deploy across a multinational enterprise. That's what their bread and butter is. Let them do that well. And let the DEI team be the expert in that content and let them identify what's going to work and what's going to land within our enterprise versus another enterprise. And I loved what you said about this idea of embedding within pre-existing talent development moments. I saw someone in the chat saying exactly that's what we do too. That is the approach I'm seeing kind of across the board, that if you're going to have an onboarding moment, if you're going to have a manager training, if you're going to have just-in-time learning around hiring or performance reviews, well, embed and infuse the lens of equity and inclusion into those trainings, build the skills, give practice, and do it often. To your point, it's not just that one time, it's keep bringing it up throughout the employee experience. So it is just who you are. It's what an individual contributor looks like and operates at this company. It's what a manager does and how they operate at this company, is doing these skills that and having these behaviors that are inherently inclusive, that inherently bring everyone along. Lisa, I know you've seen some success at Westat in terms of bringing together L&D and DE&I. I'm curious if you can share what you've seen work well, the outcomes you've driven.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak less to trends among other companies. We'll leave that for Jervis, but we could speak about our journey and what that's looked like over the years that we've been doing this. I think early on, our early stages of our journey kind of pulled on creating action. You know, we had our employees that had a lot of energy and a lot of engagement and really wanted to get involved. During this first kind of phase, we created what we call our MEI team. That stood for a multicultural education and impact team. And that provided employees with a quick way to kind of get involved and create content and to share information. We had 4 different areas. We had the celebrations team, our learning series team, our resource and knowledge team, and our storytelling team. And so, yes, again, it was very much bottom up. And that's kind of, in terms of changes within the organization, we see that a lot, especially, I think, because, again, of being an employee-owned organization. And then from there, we started to create more structure around our DEI presence. And I think with some other companies, maybe bigger companies, you might see it kind of start with the structure first. But we kind of started creating some structure, again, having wanted to leverage on the energy that had already existed around it. And that's when we started to create our ERGs and kind of maybe updating our mission statements and so forth. And then we started moving into impact, and that's when we started pulling on external resources. We started doing trainings. First, they were targeted. So we did trainings for our senior leaders, HR, our managers. I'm trying to think if there was another group. Those were definitely the main ones. And then we decided, okay, it's time to do a level set. And that's when we actually partnered with Praxis to do our DEI learning journey, is what we called it. And it just kind of was an experience that everyone was able to go through. We were able to kind of level set. People could start to have conversations with common language, and so forth. Certainly some people were more versed in what it means to take a DEI approach to work, but some weren't. And we just really wanted to make sure that, we had at least a certain basic level of knowledge that we were providing to our employees to kind of really start off this journey. And now I would say that we're really moving into measurement. So now that we're doing all these things, what measures, what metrics are we going to use to hold ourselves and continue to hold ourselves accountable? And so that's really how our journey has evolved over time, continues to evolve. And so we're looking forward to seeing how we're going to grow. And in terms of our organizational structure, I know we've talked about different approaches between having DEI separate versus having DEI within HR. For us, it's just worked well so far. For now, it works well having it because we're really able to pair it with the L&D. We don't have to worry about kind of the territorial issues that I know some organizations need to work for. We are literally on the same team. And it also has helped with facilitating the big C word, which we haven't mentioned, which is compliance. We don't necessarily want to think about it, but it's necessary. And just housing it in HR has helped us to make sure that we pay special attention to that so that we don't hit certain issues before we've really gotten going. So it's worked well. And maybe in the future we divide it out. I'm not sure, but like I said, we're continuing to evolve and meet the needs of where we are as an organization.
Yeah, Lisa, that's so helpful. And I think, we get to work with so many enterprises, companies that are beginning their journey. Maybe they did something, but they actually have to go back to basics. They have to start at the foundation. And so how do you build up formalized structures, formalized ERGs, formalized training, how it all works together? I think that's such a helpful story to tell because it can feel daunting. Maybe a new leader comes in, or maybe, you realize that we actually haven't achieved our goals because we're not even sure what we're measuring. And so I think that story of how do you start? And it sounds like you all started with some targeted approaches first. Then you brought it to the whole company to level set. And now you're saying, all right, we have a foundation. We know where we're starting. Now, where are we going? How do we move forward? What's the next step? So many of the clients we get to work with, they're thinking about measurement of their collaborative programs of L&D and DEI, leading towards more inclusion, more belonging, engagement, likelihood to stay, retention, diversity of teams, advancement and promotion of the diversity of those teams, as well as outputs of teams' productivity. So, I get to talk to clients who are looking at go-to-market teams, and are the teams that are living these values, these behaviors and practices actually outperforming? And oftentimes they see that. And I think that's really powerful to have that ROI data. So I want to go in a little bit.
Can I just add to that real quick? I just think it's so important to remember that what success looks like in your current state may not be what it looks like later on, so be prepared to say, okay, this is no longer measuring success. Now we need to move on. Success needs to look differently. And one of the other challenges that we have is wanting to catch up to where other companies are that have been doing it so long, but realizing that we need to do what's right for our stage of our journey and for our culture, and believing that we'll get there.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jarvis. It looks like you were going to jump in on that.
Yeah, I was just going to add, we have to avoid the tendency to engage in benchmarking bias. In this space, we love to see what other companies are doing and how they've progressed and done really well. A company's success or outputs in other spaces of human resources, for example, may not only be attributed to their success or impact in L&D. And so attempting to benchmark against these companies, it doesn't think about how your employees learn or consume information. It doesn't take into account the development opportunities or experiences that they want. And quite frankly, it doesn't take into account this framework that I work on with clients that looks at the difference between promotion and progression and advancement and development. They are very different. And so if you're constantly trying to say, well, this company's probably doing really well at this experience and trying to apply the exact same strategy there, it will get organ rejection every single time. So just be very conscious of that benchmarking is okay and it's appropriate, but how you design needs to be custom to your organization.
I love that. We are coming up to time, and I want to actually move to the group's Q&A. And we have some questions that are related to this topic. So Lisa, you talked about what your target is. should change, right? You should progress. It should, you have to be able to adapt and be innovative. And what the goal is, if the goal changes, knowing that your organization's your organization, yes, benchmarks are good, but you have to do what works for the enterprise you're in, the culture you're in, the environment. So one of the folks on the line wanted to know, in the ever evolving landscape of DEI and L&D, how do you stay adaptive and innovative in your approach? Whoever wants to jump in. Oh, Lisa, go for it.
Oh, I'm thinking about it. How do we stay adaptive and innovative? I think that I think one of the advantages being early in the journey is that almost anytime you do something new, it's innovative, so you can leverage that. That's exciting. I mean, I am the first in the organization. My role as the L&D was the first to exist in the company. I mean, talk about a clean slate, and the opportunity to do stuff. And the DEI specialist that preceded my role was new as well. So really, I think just having a vision, okay, let's go for it. Let's try it. Let's do this. Getting feedback from employees. Today, we're literally launching the second round of our Great Places to Work survey. We do it every other year. And so the employee feedback that we get has been great. I mean, one of the questions that we're literally asking them is, what can we do to make WhatsApp more inclusive? Because we want to hear from them. We're not going to assume that we have all the answers. And so excited to see the responses to that.
I love that. Leaning into new and innovative, leaning into what your team, your organization is looking for. Absolutely. Jarvis, anything to add on how you stay adaptive and innovative?
I think I tend to think of innovation very differently. I think that most folks tend to align innovation as net new. For me, I view innovation through the lens of net better. And so if you think about even part of what you'll hear me say often as I do lectures and keynotes is this idea of we need to obsess people innovation and social innovation the same way we do product innovation. And so if you think about the work that Nike has done for a number of years, yes, there has been new products developed over time, but a lot of what comes out of the innovation space is improvements and making net better certain incredible products that the organization has already had. And so thinking about how we do that in our organizations matters as well. It is easy to assume that work in the people and culture space is just broken. And so we tend to move with the throw everything out at the same time approach and then onboard new ATS, onboard new CRM. And by the time people catch up and the change management required to do that, it can be very challenging. And so I think resetting our frame to think of innovation in this space as net better goes a long way, and figure out in a piecemeal fashion what is going to be our short-term, midterm, and long-term plans around this. This is not a boil the ocean exercise, but it is one where if we define where are going to be our core areas of focus and get big wins in those areas on an ongoing and consistent basis, that is also a form of innovation because it is going to feel relatively net new in its experience to how employees are receiving or consuming.
Yes, I love that. You don't need to throw everything out. You can augment, you can edit, you can add in new types of measurement, you can add in a new way of learning that same content instead of saying this is all, we're taking it to the garbage can. And I think that is something that is a good reminder. We have some questions on some specifics. And so I'm going to share them in terms of one around metrics and one around content. What are some of those key L&D metrics tied to DE&I that folks on the line can be thinking about? And then also, what are some of the key topics to include in an L&D strategy beyond unconscious bias training, beyond microaggressions? And are all topics the right topics to embed, or are there other topics? And so key L&D metrics tied to DE&I and key topics beyond microaggressions and unconscious bias that we should be embedding in L&D. Jarvis, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start out. I'll start actually with the content. I think this also varies by organization. And I think we have to avoid a tendency to have only a couple of different training options that are done enterprise-wide. Oftentimes, what you might discover is that very specific teams, and this is where data comes into play heavily, very specific teams might need specific content to improve upon their experience. So, for example, topics that I do think could live at the enterprise level are topics like cultural competency, the impact of psychological safety, intersectionality and identity covering, unveiling the impact of microaggressions, unconscious bias, and how we drive further toward conscious allyship. Depending on where the company is located geographically, you might do an org-wide approach to understanding of gender identity and the spectrum that it is, race and racism, etc. I think, though, for specific teams where you need to have curated learning pathways in this space might include areas that are data informed. So let's say throughout our employee engagement surveys, we quickly discover through the lens of like a heat map that a certain organization actually sees women and non-binary identified individuals having a significantly different experience than male identified folks on the team. That might imply that there is not the right kind of education happening to understand how to more effectively lead across lines of difference or create psychologically safe engagements for people who are not often seen in positions of management or leadership. On the flip side, you might also find that if a team is more monolithic in other elements of identity, it might be difficult for someone who is transgender identified or part of the LGBTQ community more broadly to engage collectively with that team. So you might do specific pathways that might not necessarily be useful right now for the whole organization and from a required learning fashion, but you can leverage those for specific people and teams within the organization. One of the free resources that we offer on rainbowdisruption.com is a list of all of those different trainings and then different holidays that you can think about, talk about, and expect from it. On the metric side, I struggle when we talk about L&D metrics specifically related to DEI because I don't want to shift how we measure effectiveness of adult learning generally. That's where we start to get in a bit of hazy territory when we start to measure our DEI work differently than how we measure traditional approaches to success tied to corporate strategy or people strategy. So some metrics though that I do think are helpful. General engagement, but get comfortable with aggregation. I want to see engagement by level. I want to see engagement by identity or demographic. I want to see engagement at the executive leadership team level. Leveraging that engagement resources to then foster accountability from the ELT down can go a long way. Another great metric that I think is useful is application. So oftentimes we do the L&D work, we do the DEI work, we do our engagement surveys. Nobody talks about them together. Are we seeing leaders who committed to 100% of their team taking unconscious bias awareness, seeing a tangible improvement in their engagement survey results year over year? And if not, why? That might tend to imply that there's a delta between what we are teaching and how it is landing, or how teams can think about practical ways to integrate it into their day-to-day working. And starting to view the data in a way that is speaking to each other can really go a long way in that regard. And I'll say the final metric that I think is really useful in the space is looking at long-term improvement around how people are interacting with the different approaches to learning and development. Meaning, if we are putting a lot of money and resources, and I don't know if we'll get to it, but I know there was a question around like improvement of experiences for Black employees specifically, we need to have measured approaches that says, let's have these leaders attend this development program, but as the now so topical cliche highlights, people of color and women are often over mentored and under sponsored. What does that mean though? We're investing all these dollars in development. Is the career trajectory of these folks to move to promotion or progression actually accelerated relative to one, their counterparts, or any other similarly situated individual that didn't go through that program? So what I'm arguing is we really need a strong focus on people analytics generally, that then aligns to L&D analytics, that then aligns to representation analytics on the DEI representation front. And then how do we ensure that that data is speaking to each other to tell a more holistic story?
Yes, 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 and yes. Lisa, curious what you would add, what you have a differing point of view here in terms of the content, in terms of the metrics.
No, I think for us, again, this is kind of the stage that we're in. So we're definitely trying to figure it out. Fortunately, we work for a research company, and really we have no shortage of people who can operationalize certain concepts. So we're excited to kind of pull them in, figure out what those metrics will look like. In terms of our focus for trainings, I think we still have a bit of, we're still relying a bit on external resources because we're kind of new to this. We want to get a sense of what are the best practices, and we want to bring in knowledge from outside to enhance what we have internally. So
yeah, I love that. I know we're coming up to time, And I've seen in the chat that this has been helpful. It's been powerful. I want to give each of you 30 seconds to either share a prediction or a piece of advice for folks who joined in this conversation, who wanted to learn from you all. Lisa, I'm going to start with you. A prediction or a piece of advice on how to make sure DEI and L&D have successful collaborations and outcomes that make a difference for the employee experience.
So I'll give some advice that's maybe even a bit more general than that. So I was told by someone who's been in this area for a long time, the DEI is not for the faint at heart. And he wasn't lying. It's not easy work. You will have, the more involved you become in it, the more difficult conversations you have, and the more deep those difficult conversations become. I would say lean into it. That's what this work is about. That's where your learning is going to happen. That's where you're going to make, have your impact. So just
Yes,
lean into it.
lean into it. Jarvis, 30 seconds.
Partial prediction, partial solution. In a world of political polarization, we are starting to see attacks on DEI right now. It's only going to get worse. Solution: we need our L&D partners, we need our HR business partners to start embedding and integrating everything that we're doing and talking about right now. That way, as the attacks continue to happen, it won't be noticed if it's already built into onboarding and employee lifecycle, because we avoid this tendency to see it as diversity recruiting. It's just recruiting. It's not diversity education. It's just learning and education in the organization. It's not diversity marketing. It's just good market segmentation. We need you to be getting after that right now, because this year is going to be a little dicey for us all.
Oh my goodness. Jarvis, Lisa, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your brilliance with this community. Achieve Engagement, thank you for hosting us. You heard their takeaways. It's going to get hard. You have to lean into it, and you have to embed equity, inclusion, and diversity work throughout the employee experience to have the outcomes that we're looking for. I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you all so much for joining us. You will get a recording. We will follow up and try to answer the questions we didn't get to answer. Stay connected, share. Let's be this community that helps us get through, that helps us achieve, and let's see those outcomes together. Thank you so much.